In my previous two videos, I showed how an evolution professor had made false claims about science. Well, that evolution professor had also made claims about an evolution skeptic, Dr. Michael Behe. He called Behe a liar. Well, now that evolution professor is challenging me to address his claims about Behe as well. Okay, here goes. The evolution professor sent me this message saying, look, I've made these 3 arguments as to why Behe is a dishonest liar. Please address these specific arguments. Okay, the first one was Darwinism is representative of modern evolutionary theory. So the evolution professor claims this is a lie. Well, there's a lot to unpack here, but first, Behe doesn't actually make this claim. Nowhere does Behe state this in his article. Yes, Behe does use the term Darwinism, so do evolutionists. The term Darwinism, in a general sense, is absolutely standard. The evolution professor's accusation of lying amounts to, we can say it, but you can't. So here's an example. The evolution professor likes Google, so to Google we go. Darwinism, and the AI overview gives us this explanation that Darwinism is a scientific explanation for the diversity of life on Earth. This is a general overview. Now we get into the key concepts of Darwinism: natural selection, adaptation, variation, common ancestry, and so forth. These are general concepts of evolutionary theory. Darwinism. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, a little more nuanced, but the same idea, a general overview of evolution. Wikipedia, Darwinism, natural selection, and so forth. Michael Krause pointed this out last year. Here's a volume by Michael Ruse, Darwinism Defended. This is talking about the current evolutionary theory. He's using the term Darwinism. In the foreword, Ernst Mayr writes, to a convinced Darwinian like myself, it may seem puzzling that in this day and age, Darwinism should still be in need of defense. So was Ernst Mayr one of the leading evolutionists of the 20th century, and Michael Ruse, a leading evolutionary thinker, dishonest liars? How about Richard Dawkins?
We have in Darwinism a brilliant example of how you can get from primeval simplicity to not ultimate, but very, very great complexity.
So is Richard Dawkins a dishonest liar because he says Darwinism? This criticism of Behe is absurd. These are general understandings of the term Darwinism as a major move in the history of ideas, and entirely consistent with Behe's use of the term. But it gets worse because, well, let's look at what Behe actually says in his article. In his blog article, the term Darwinism appears 6 times. But wait, in 4 of those instances, it appears within the term Neo-Darwinism. So here's a couple of examples of Neo-Darwinism in his article. He's explaining how Darwin's idea, Darwin's theory of evolution, eventually became Neo-Darwinism in the mid-20th century. Here, Behe explains how Darwin's theory eventually became known as Neo-Darwinism. In other words, Behe was taking pains to explain distinctions. Behe also mentioned the similar term modern synthesis, and the later hypothesis, extended evolutionary synthesis. Behe was not hiding the fact that evolutionary theory has run through several iterations. He was openly discussing them, but none of them succeed, and that was his point. For Behe, the various attempts at an evolutionary theory all fail. They amount to rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. They're all futile, as Behe explains in this passage here. Behe was not stating that Darwin's particular version of evolutionary theory has not changed. For example, Darwin had a 19th century primitive understanding of genetics. Did Behe claim today's evolutionary theory entails that same primitive understanding of genetics? Of course not. Behe explicitly discussed how Darwin's idea led to Neo-Darwinism via a lot of math. So, number one, the first argument from the evolutionary professor is absurd and completely falls apart. Let's move on to the second argument here. Evolutionary biologists go mute when asked how new traits evolve. Now note, the claim is specifically that biologists don't want to talk about it, not about the merits of the mechanisms themselves. So that's the argument that the evolution professor is putting forth. But again, that is not the claim. Behe did not say that. That is false and a misrepresentation of Behe. The evolution professor is blatantly misrepresenting Behe. So back to the blog article from Behe, he writes, "It's right about here that Darwin boosters go mute." Now, what does he mean by right about here? He's talking about the evolution of higher levels of complexity. To support his point here, he quotes from a recent peer-reviewed evolution article, an article written by evolutionists, peer-reviewed by evolutionists, in one of the top journals in the United States. It's in the Proceedings of the NAS, the National Academy of Sciences, which is one of the top science organizations in the United States. What does it say? Modern evolutionary theory has little to say about the actual history of life, especially the emergence of new levels of biological complexity, and nothing at all about the origin of life, end quote. So Behe continues here, but those are exactly the most intriguing questions. Why, after more than a century and a half, does Darwin's theory still fail to account for the mysteries it had promised to explain? See, Behe is not saying they don't want to talk about it. He's saying the theory fails. They cannot talk about it because of the merits of the mechanisms. Now, back to this idea of Darwin's theory. Again, it is an absurd mischaracterization to claim Behe is talking about 19th century genetics when he says Darwin's theory here. If you don't understand this, just look above where it says modern evolutionary theory. Behe is referring to this quote here. Behe's point is that the overarching idea, as in the quote from the PNAS paper, has failed. Behe refers to Darwin's theory just as evolutionists do. Now, Behe is not saying evolutionists don't want to talk about the evolution of new levels of complexity, as the evolution professor claimed. Behe is saying they can't because of the merits of the mechanisms, the opposite of what the evolution professor claimed. Now, for reference, here is that paper itself. Modern evolutionary theory has little to say about the actual history of life, especially the emergence of new levels of biological complexity, and nothing at all about the origin of life. So there you have it. Not only did the evolution professor misrepresent Behe, but he insisted the evolution of new levels of complexity was not a problem.
Right? So if you were to go on Google Scholar or something, right, and you were to look up bat wing evolution, how do wings evolve? How did whales evolve to be marine? You're going to find literal books answering those questions.
So in my previous video, I looked at, yes, bat wing evolution. As per the evolution professor's instructions, I went to Google Scholar, and there was no such evolutionary explanation as the professor had insisted there would be. In fact, quite the opposite. Here's a paper, "The Evolution of Novel Traits is an Outstanding Question in Evolutionary Biology." Now, outstanding did not mean really good. It meant unknown. In other words, the evolution of novel traits is an unsolved problem, or they go mute, because of the merits of the mechanisms. Not because they don't want to talk about it, because they cannot talk about it. Exactly what Behe had said, and exactly the opposite of what the evolution professor said. In other words, what Behe said represents the literature, whereas the evolution professor misrepresented the literature, and he misrepresented Behe. Okay, so number 2 was another failed criticism, another failed reason why Behe is a dishonest liar, according to the evolution professor. Let's move on to his third argument. Evolution persists because it is passed from mentor to student through intellectual inertia, because biologists are intimidated by the math from the 1950s and therefore haven't challenged it. The evolution professor denies this, so this is something Behe had said, and the evolution professor is denying it, and furthermore thinks it is a lie. It makes Behe out to be a liar. This reflects the naive understanding of the philosophy of science. Are there evolutionists who are evolutionists because of the evidence? Yes, sure. Not due to intellectual inertia. Are there life scientists who are good at math? Yes, of course. They're not intimidated by the math. But for every evolutionist who has thought through the evidence, there are many who have not. I know because I've talked with them. The idea of intellectual inertia and that science can be a conservative project that resists change and theory falsification is hardly new. This is a well-studied aspect of science. This really is not controversial, and for Behe to point to intellectual inertia as one of the reasons for evolution's persistence is not at all a stretch. To deny Behe that move places you firmly in the "we can say it but you can't" camp. And then to accuse Behe, therefore, of lying is absurd and really not a good look. Now, regarding math, again, for every life scientist who is good at math, there are many who are not. Compared to physics and engineering, it simply is less quantitative. I admire the work of many life scientists, and many are good at math. But it is hardly a stretch to point to math as an underlying stumbling block and potential additional cause. Now, let me step back for some observations about all this. I want to say a few words about context. Now, this year is coincidentally the 100-year anniversary of the famous Scopes monkey trial in 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee. In mid-20th century America, there was an anti-communist hysteria which became known as McCarthyism after a senator who led the hysteria. McCarthy accused people of communist sympathies, blackballed them, and ruined their careers. McCarthyism was eventually exposed and defeated, leaving a legacy of anti-intellectualism, lies, bigotry, blackballing, abuse, ruined careers, etc. It was ugly. In the midst of this, Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible, a play to help expose McCarthyism. Miller brilliantly used the 17th century witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts as his vehicle. A few years later, playwrights Jerome Lawrence and Robert Lee tried again with their play Inherit the Wind. Lawrence and Lee used the 1925 Scopes monkey trial as their vehicle. But the monkey trial did not work very well. Lawrence and Lee heavily fictionalized the 1925 events for their purposes. They cast the events into the then popular warfare thesis, a false history of religion and science, where religion fulfilled all those negative stereotypes. The 1955 play became a Broadway hit, and movie and TV versions followed, most famously the 1960 Stanley Kramer film by the same name. But unlike the Salem witch trials, which had strong parallels with McCarthyism, the monkey trial had no such similarity. What Lawrence and Lee really needed for a metaphor was the warfare thesis. So they fictionalized and transformed the monkey trial into the warfare thesis. Inherit the Wind was an illusion. The script used the ahistorical warfare thesis as its template. The script presented a false reality. It was a mythical tale using the 1925 monkey trial to gain an aura of realism. Now, the events surrounding the monkey trial were initiated by the ACLU. In a scheme cooked up at Fred Robinson's drugstore in Dayton, Tennessee, Methodist George Rapalje spotted an ACLU ad looking for challengers to a Tennessee anti-evolution law. Rapalje and school superintendent Walter White saw it as a way to boost the town. Teacher John Scopes agreed to break the law. Lawyers Herbert and Sue Hicks, who were friends of John Scopes, agreed to prosecute. Scopes was found guilty, but the legal outcome was not highly consequential. What mattered was the mythology it created. According to the Inherit the Wind script, the character representing John Scopes was a humble and tireless science teacher, hauled off to jail by an angry mob of religious fundamentalists, led by a Reverend Jeremiah Brown, for trying to enlighten his science students. In fear for his life, he contacts a journalist for help in securing a lawyer. Well, the reality of the events in Dayton were that the ACLU, never mentioned in the script, placed an ad in the Chattanooga Times seeking a volunteer to test Tennessee law on the teaching of evolution in the public schools. Local boosters in Dayton saw this as an opportunity to put them on the map and recruited Scopes, a coach, and part-time teacher to break the law. Scopes was never incarcerated, but rather spent most of his time hobnobbing with reporters. There was no angry mob and no vitriolic preacher. Now here's some scenes from the 1960 movie Inherit the Wind. You've got in the upper left there the Scopes character, the character representing Scopes in jail, looking out the window very, very pensively at this angry mob down below, throwing rocks and bottles through his window there. He gets hit by some shards of glass. That angry mob, as you can see on the upper right, they've got their signs, they've got fires burning, they got their pitchforks and so forth. They're ready to do something. He's in fear for his life. Now, down at the bottom there, you have the lawyer who's going to be prosecuting. This is the character representing William Jennings Bryan. He comes to town and meets with his legal team. They go to a restaurant, and he is depicted as a glutton, as a loudmouth, ignorant glutton. It's really just hilarious, this scene where waiters are bringing him these huge trays of food, one after the other, and he's just wolfing down this food and talking with his mouth full and so forth. And his legal team is sitting there. What do they have? Glasses of water in front of them, nothing else, and they're looking kind of embarrassed about this lead lawyer here. It's a two-dimensional cardboard cartoon that is just all using this warfare thesis as its template. Really rather silly. Inherit the Wind was soon integrated into public schools. It was a big hit, as I mentioned. So this movie and the play was soon integrated into public school curricula and the public consciousness. It became a cultural icon. The warfare thesis became an accepted truism. Now, I know something about this because I was in school at the time, and a unit based on Inherit the Wind we went through that, watched the film and read the book and so forth. It was presented and we studied it as a true and compelling cautionary tale. So Inherit the Wind became this cultural icon and it was admired by legal experts as a cogent and accurate rendition of the 1925 trial. This legal expert, Andrew Cohen, for example, called it one of the great trial movies of all time. More importantly, and really more hilariously, it was also noted by one John E. Jones. Now, about 80 years after this monkey trial, the ACLU got another trial in Pennsylvania. This was in the early 2000s. And who was the judge? Federal Judge John E. Jones. Now, after this trial, he was hailed as a great judge for ruling in the favor of the ACLU in this hilarious trial. He admitted that he wanted to see Inherit the Wind a second time. He had seen it in college. He wanted to see it a second time in preparation for the Dover case. Why? Because the film, as he put it, puts the origins debate into its proper historical context. Regarding his preparation for the Dover case, Jones later explained that I understood the general theme. I'd seen Inherit the Wind. Unbelievable. Evolution, the warfare thesis, and Inherit the Wind brought us to tribalism. Delegitimization, discrimination, blackballing, and slander of evolution skeptics all became acceptable and approved. Anyone so much as doubting evolution, that is, that the world arose by itself, which is what evolution claims and is refuted by science, was the new communist sympathizer. I know something about this because I lost career opportunities because of my scientific questioning of the theory of evolution. And so did a lot of other people, as documented by Jerry Bergman in this volume. And of course, there was the shameful discrimination of Guillermo Gonzalez at Iowa State University. That was a shameful case. So if you were doubting the Epicurean, the world arose by itself, the evolutionary narrative, you were labeled as dogmatic, anti-intellectual, opposing the evidence, dishonest slanderers. We'll look at this video by the evolution professor on Michael Behe. He's claiming Behe is this dishonest liar. and manipulating the law and ruining people's careers by the association with McCarthyism and so forth. But wait, these are all the very attributes that describe evolutionists. The accusations they hurl at scientists describe their own actions. This is the context for the evolution professor's false claims in response to Michael Behe.